Everyone, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I wanted to share with all of you a review of the Makeup Forever HD Skin Sculpting Palette. So this is a palette I've been using for a while. I picked this up during the Sephora VIB sale back in the fall. And honestly, this is a palette that I didn't think I would pick up. It's not really the kind of product I normally go for. Basically, I saw some really positive reviews from Michelle Wong, and it still wasn't really enough to convince me, since this is a palette that seems much more geared towards makeup artists rather than just individuals who only apply makeup on themselves. But then I went in store and I swatched these shades, and the formulation really intrigued me. Basically, when you put on this formula, it's a remarkably natural finish on the skin. Like, I don't know if you guys will even really be able to see that super clearly. Let me actually put a little bit on top of this scar over here. So you can see that it actually packs a decent amount of coverage, but it looks very natural in the finish. Basically, it's not luminous, it's not shiny, but it's also not matte or flat, and it just blends in super seamlessly. So that's what really attracted me, because I just felt like this formulation just seemed so nice and comfy on the skin and very flattering. And so I figured I would give this a try, and in the past several months, I've actually really fallen in love with this palette. It's kind of been surprising to me how much I reach for this on a regular basis. And so I wanted to film a dedicated video in case any of you guys are curious about this palette. So to start off, let's just go over the packaging. So there are two separate sides to this palette. The colors on the outside match the colors on the inside. Unfortunately, they only have one colorway for this, which is the one I have here. I do think this works really well for folks with a light to medium complexion like myself. I have seen Glam Girl Chelsea review this as well, and she can make it work, but it does seem like the tones are a little bit less versatile on her tan skin tone. On this side of the palette, these formulations are all meant to be all over complexion products. You can use them as foundation and also as a lighter weight concealer. On this side, the top two shades are meant to be contour and bronzing shades, and the bottom four are highlighting shades. And apologies, my palette is a little bit messy, as you guys will see shortly. I love using my BK Beauty 109 brush to dip into these, which is overall a very good shape, but it does get a little bit messy around the edges. So that's why it looks like this. And yeah, I haven't really gone through the trouble of cleaning it off yet. Let's go in with some swatches to start. So let me first just give you guys swatches of these foundation / concealer shades. These are super creamy to touch, really nicely emollient. So here you can see the first four shades. The first one is definitely quite light on my skin tone, so I use this in conjunction with other shades to brighten up my complexion. The next three actually all work pretty well for me all over my skin. It's just slightly different undertones. The first one is a bit more yellowy, the second one is more neutral peachy, and the last one has a bit more oranginess to it. And these last two in the winter time I use more as bronzing products, but I anticipate in the summertime that this one might work well all over the face for me. But this one certainly brings a lot of warmth. As you guys can see, it is quite orange as a bronzer, and so I find this works really well on my forehead area just to add some warmth back to my complexion. Now let's do the two contour shades. And I really love this lighter contour shade. This is one that I always use anytime I dip into this palette. As you can see, it is quite cool toned. It has a little bit of that gray undertone to it. And on my skin tone, this is a really perfect sculpting shade. The other one is a little bit too deep for me at the moment. I can use it very sparingly as a bronzer, and so I do sometimes dip in a little bit. But I find that this one over here is a little bit lighter, so at the moment in the wintertime, I prefer using this over this. Finally, let's go into these highlights. And honestly, these are the shades I use the least in this palette. I think because they all sort of look similar, like you can see they're not fully opaque. They are highlights, and so you shouldn't expect this to stand out a lot color-wise on your skin. They're a lovely, lovely formula. They look really beautiful and natural on the skin. Perfect for just adding a little bit more dimension to the face. But especially these two on me look basically exactly the same. This one, even though it looks pigmented and swatch, just provides a really beautiful golden glow. Whereas this one's a little bit deep for my complexion. But I can use it to just add some luminosity to my bronzer. And here are all of the shades close up with the light turned down. And today I'll try to showcase as many of these on my face as I can for you guys. So to start with today's demo, let's go in with that BK Beauty 109 brush. And I'm going to first just start with these three shades, which as I mentioned, kind of work well for me all over the face. And let me actually just kind of give you guys some stripes of them so you can see what they look like. So here is that first one. As you can see, it's a pretty decent shade match for me. Then kind of going into the second one over here. Again, also works on my complexion. And then the third one over here. So yeah, a little bit deeper. But I can definitely make all three of these work. And one thing I do like about this palette is I think it's going to carry me throughout the year very nicely. Like as I get more tan, I can just use the deeper shades. At the moment, these two shades are both really good on my skin tone. Maybe just a little bit deeper than my natural skin tone, but blended out, I think they look quite nice. And when I first got this palette, I thought I wouldn't like how you kind of want to, in theory, cocktail your ideal combination. I thought that would just be a lot of hassle, but I've actually found it to be really fun. As you can see, I can just go in with this one shade and that is totally fine. Like that's what I'm gonna use mostly across my face today. And it's a good enough shade match, especially because this product gives you kind of medium coverage. If it was full coverage, then I think the slight differences in undertone would be more noticeable. But just putting this all over my face right now, you can see just how quick and easy that was. And it just blends in super nicely as well. I just love this formula because it's emollient enough that it really blends in super smoothly. Your face doesn't feel dry at all. For context, I have normal to dry skin, but it also is not one of those super dewy foundations where you feel like you have to set it. Like, I feel like I can just leave it like this, have that sort of natural glow, and that's totally fine. So here we have it on this side of my face, nothing on this side. I think you can just see how nicely smoothed this side looks in comparison to this side. Definitely covered up all this sort of pigmentation that I have. So I'm going to do the same thing on the other side again, kind of mostly just going into that first shade. I will say if I were designing this palette or giving feedback to Makeup Forever, that having these two shades be so close to each other is, I think, a little bit of a waste just in terms of making this palette useful for most people. Like the differences between this and this are pretty slight. For me, I think it works out because my skin tone's sort of right around these two, and so whether I dip into this one or if I, for example, go in now with this one, it's not really that big of a deal. And so if I'm feeling like I really want to channel my inner makeup artist, then sometimes I will actually go into both and just sort of, you know, try to mix them together to just get my perfect shade. But if you have a very different skin tone than me, then I think you'll find that these two are maybe less useful to have in a single palette. And for context, I have a light medium skin tone with sort of neutral to yellow undertones. So here we have the product all over my face. Now let's start adding some more dimensions. So let's first go in with this lightest shade, which again is very light on me. So I actually don't typically go in with this. Usually I would go in with a concealer at this point, but for today, because I want to use as many of these shades as possible for you guys, I'm going to use this under my eyes just to add a little bit of brightness. And actually, let me go in with my BK Beauty A506 brush. This is my favorite concealer brush, and this can just help target it really in specific areas. And I do like that this formula is really buildable, so I do find that if I am just going in for a no makeup day, or even just like a kind of natural makeup day, I don't have to use concealer. Like you can see how with a few layers of this product under the eyes, it basically canceled out my dark circles. So I really like that element. And then I'm going to just also put a little bit of this elsewhere along the center of my face for that brightening effect. So a bit on the nose as well, and the chin. There is a pretty big jump between this lightest shade and the next lightest shade, which on the one hand is good if you want to cocktail your own shade. It means if you have a lighter skin tone than me, you can kind of mix these two together to get something that works. But of course, it's not great if you want something just kind of straight out of pan that will work for your complexion. So now let's start bringing in some shadows. So normally I would just go into this contour shade and this bronzing shade, but for today's video, I want to showcase all of the shades. So I'm going to first take a little bit of this shade and just sort of put it around the perimeter of my face, just so you guys can see. It's not going to add a lot of difference, but just a tiny bit more dimension around there. Yeah, actually, sorry. I don't know if that really was visible for you guys, but maybe you can just see it's a tiny bit deeper now on that outer part. Let's go into this shade now and add some of that. So you can see that has a bit more warmth. As a side note, this is adding more layers on than I would normally go for. But again, you guys can see how this formulation is buildable even if you add on way more layers than you normally do. So if I wanted just a very subtle dimension, I think going in with this shade would provide that. But of course, we're going in harder today, so I'm going in now with that bronzy shade and just putting this all over my forehead area. Because my forehead is where I get the most sun exposure, naturally that part of my face is a bit bronzier and warmer in tone. So I like that with this palette I can sort of recreate that. So there we go, just added a bit more dimension around that part of my face. Now let's go in with this contour shade. And as you guys can see, it is a true contour. It has that nice cool undertone to it. Really good for sculpting. This is actually the shade that most attracted me to this palette. So Makeup Forever does have a few other of these palettes. They have one that is half blush. They also have one that's sort of supposed to be an all-in-one that has foundation, bronzer, and blush. That palette does come in two colorways, one for lighter skin tones and one for deeper skin tones. And so if you do have a deeper skin tone, I'd suggest going for that one because that has more versatility. The one thing that doesn't have is these sort of cooler tone shades. In general, those all-in-one palettes for Makeup Forever kind of run a bit warmer, which is why I decided to go in with this one. Because personally, I've been a much bigger fan of these kinds of cool tone contours in comparison to warm tone bronzers lately. And now with my BK Beauty 112 brush, I'm gonna also run some of that along my nose just to contour that out. But definitely, if you have a deeper skin tone, I don't think it's worth it to pick up this palette just for this contour shade, because as you can see, it's a pretty light contour. It definitely, I think, would tap out at the medium skin tone range. And now for this shade, I do want to take just a tiny bit of it just to show you guys, but I do need to be careful with this shade at the moment with my present complexion. So I'm just going to dab a little bit of this on both sides just to add a tad bit more dimension. Again though, I do love how forgiving this palette is. Even if you apply a lot, I think you can blend it out pretty easily. Taking a tiny bit more of this as well for my forehead area. And one thing that's nice about this palette is because everything is kind of in a similar formulation, The products all really blend together seamlessly, and it is quite handy just having them all together. Whenever I use this palette, I do sort of feel like a makeup artist in that, you know, you're kind of mixing and matching things, using whatever shades sort of speak to you. And so I find this actually really fun to play around with. And to bring a tiny bit of warmth to the nose area, I'm also going to take a little bit of this shade. Oops, that's a little much. Let's try to blend that out. There we go. Now for the highlighters, they're not going to look super different on my skin, but I'll show them to you guys anyway, just so you can see. So let's first go into the more pigmented one, and I'm going to just put this kind of where I bronzed, so hopefully you guys can see that. Technically, you could in theory use this sort of as a brown toned blush if you wanted. It does have a pretty subtle but beautiful sheen to it. Do that on this side as well. Hopefully you guys can see a bit of that glow. In general, my face is looking very dewy right now just because I put so many layers of this on, but that is really pretty. Now for the golden one, I'm gonna put it on this side of my face, just on the high points. I don't know if you guys can really see that, but it's pretty subtle again. Perfect for that sort of lit from within glow. This is not gonna give you any sort of noticeable shimmer on the cheeks, but it'll definitely give you a bit of shine. And then going into this lighter one, I'm going to use this on the other cheek. Hopefully you guys can see some of that. Truly, this palette lives up to its name in terms of sculpting. So it's going to give you that illusion of having this natural bone structure rather than like you put a lot of makeup on. And actually I'm going to use some of that same shade on my nose as well, just to highlight the center. And for the lightest shade, this one is a little light on me. I'll put some on my forehead just so you guys can see. Definitely can still make it work in that it's sheer, but I find it's a little bit brighter than I would normally go for. Alrighty, so that is all of the shades on my face. Hopefully this gives you guys some general impression. My face is so much glowier than it normally is when I use this palette because typically I just go in with one layer and call it a day, but if you do want to have more coverage, this is kind of what it would look like all built up. On a normal day, basically I would just go in with probably this shade, maybe a little bit of this shade, some of this on the forehead, this to contour, and then this shade to highlight. So I wouldn't go in with all of them like today, but you can definitely get a pretty look with all of them if you have a similar complexion to me. So now I want to go in with a little bit of my Huda Beauty powder just to show you guys how it looks powdered down. This is definitely not a necessary step if you use a lighter layer, but I think today, given just how much of this I put on, it will definitely benefit from some powder. So here's some powder just along the center of my face. You can see that sort of instantly took down the shine. Let me just powder the rest of this half of my face so you guys can see the difference. All right, so this side has the Huda powder, this side does not. This side is definitely more mattified, but I think this has brought it back down to just looking very natural. There's no kind of dryness at all. Even on some of my problem areas, like around my nose and mouth, I feel like this is looking pretty nice. And here we have the fully powdered face. So now I'm gonna go off camera, finish off the rest of my makeup look, and then be back for some comparison swatches and my overall thoughts about this palette. So here we have the final look. What do you guys think? As always, all the products I used today will be linked in my description box below, but in case you're curious, almost everything on my face is from this Natasha Denona Hyper Natural Face Palette. For today's look, I used these 3 eyeshadows, and then I used a bit of the contour and a bit of the blush all over my face. And I think the look turned out very nice. And then on my lips, I have Lave Nu from Merit Beauty. So zooming you guys out, let's do a few comparison swatches. So I have some of my other cream products here. I have my Merit Beauty foundation stick in the shade Sand. This is one of my current favorites. So I was kind of curious which of these shades this would look most similar to. And I think you can see here it's very similar to this shade over here. So this shade is the fourth shade in the palette. It's kind of between the third and fourth shade. And this shade at the moment is a little bit deep on me, and so I think that's reflected in this comparison, since today I mostly used this shade and then a little bit of this shade. But the formulation actually looks quite similar. I feel like the finish is pretty much exactly the same on the swatch, at least. In my experience with these two products, I would say that the Merit one has a little bit more coverage because this is a foundation concealer hybrid. The Makeup Forever is a bit more emollient, but both of them are definitely very easy to use, blend out super easily. When I use the Merit when I'm traveling, sometimes I just use a finger to blend it out, and I think you could do the same with the Makeup Forever as well. So this is definitely another product I would recommend, and if you're around the shade Sand, I think this palette would work pretty well for you. I also have my Clé de Peau concealer in the shade 2 Ochre. Let's see how this looks. I'm going to put this a little bit higher so you guys can see it right there. And this kind of emphasizes just how light the lightest shade is. You can see that Ochre is very similar to the second shade in the palette. It has that yellow undertone that's a bit more prominent than what we saw in the Merit. So similarly, if you're around Ochre in Clé de Peau, I think this palette would work quite well for you. And then I also have my Stretch Concealer from Glossier in the shade G8. This is actually still one of my favorite concealers, even though it's sort of an oldie. And I'll put this one over here on this side. Hopefully you guys can see that. So yeah, this one is very similar to the second shade in this palette. So it's just a little bit more neutral and less yellowy than this first shade. It looks a lot like the second one over here. In terms of formulation, I would say that the Glossier is definitely more hydrating. It's a bit more emollient on the skin, and it also has higher coverage. But that said, the formulations are somewhat similar in that I think both for the Makeup Forever and the Glossier, you don't have to powder if you don't want to. Moving right along, I also have the Merit foundation stick in the shade Amber. This I use as sort of a bronzing shade. So let's put that over here. I intuited correctly. It's basically very similar to this shade in the Makeup Forever palette. I guess I basically have a dupe for most of the shades in this palette. So this I find is a nice, very warm toned bronzer that is not going to add a lot of depth, but will add a bit more natural bronziness to the skin. In terms of the contour shade, I thought of Terra from M Cosmetics. This is their So Soft contour. So let's put a little bit of that right here. I would say Terra is a bit more pigmented than the Makeup Forever shade, but they're very similar in terms of the actual color. The Makeup Forever one is just going to be a little bit more natural, whereas the Terra one will take a little bit more blending out. Next we have Harmony from LYS. This is their very viral bronzing stick, which I've been loving. And yes, this looks kind of similar, I guess, to the bronzing shade here, but you can see how much warmer the Makeup Forever is compared to the LYS. The LYS one definitely has less of that red orangey vibe. I would say the LYS is also a little bit thinner of a formula, so it blends out pretty easily even though it's super pigmented. Whereas the Makeup Forever is going to be a little bit more controlled. It's going to stay more where you put it, whereas this one has a little bit more flow to it. Next we have Bronze Flash from Hourglass. So this is one of their highlighters in a bronzy shade. So I'm going to put that over here. So that's a little bit deeper and bronzier than this gold bronze shade. It is kind of like a mix between the two deepest highlighters in the Makeup Forever, but the Hourglass definitely has more of a metallic sheen to it. I don't know if you guys can see in camera, but when it hits the light, it has a more fiery glow to it. In general, I think this product has a bit more base to it, so whereas the Makeup Forever ones really kind of look translucent on the skin and just provide that glow, this will provide a bit of bronzy color to the skin as well. And then finally we have Kava, which is a highlighting balm from Merit Beauty. I'm going to put that right here at the end. And this one is actually whiter than the lightest highlight from the Makeup Forever. It's also much more dewy and liquidy, I would say. Much more of a balm than a cream, but hopefully that gives you a sense of the shade even though the formulation is so different. And here is a close-up of all of those comparison swatches. I think I actually did a pretty good job of finding possible dupes for most of the items in this palette. I think there's a lot of formulation differences, but the shades have some definite similarities. If you do use a lot of these products, I think the Makeup Forever is a great investment because, of course, if you bought all of these separately, it would cost way more than the cost of this palette. So with all those comparisons out of the way, let's get into my overall thoughts and impressions about this palette. So on the whole, I actually really like this palette. It's been a very surprising purchase for me because I'm normally someone who's not that finicky, especially when it comes to my base. So the idea of going into all of these different shades and playing around with them is not usually what I prefer. For context, I'm someone who really likes eyeshadow palettes and I like having fun with all the subtle differences there. But at least up until picking this palette up, I didn't think I would feel that way about complexion. Normally, I'm just someone who wants a few products that I know work well for me. But since picking this up, I've been grabbing for it quite a lot. And I think what's really fun about this palette is that you do have all these things in one place, which is really convenient. And there's a lot of sort of additional steps that you might not do otherwise, but for the fact that it's so conveniently laid out. So for example, typically I'm someone who always needs to go in with some powder bronzer. And so I don't actually go for cream contour or bronzer on most days if I'm not doing like a full face of makeup. Similarly, I'm not someone who typically goes in with cream highlighter. If I want highlight, I'll just do some powder highlight at the end. But this whole half is something I do use whenever I pick up this palette. And so it does add a few more steps to my routine, but it's steps that I'm willingly taking on just because I think it's fun to play around with this palette. In addition, even though it does take a little bit more time to use this side and put everything together, I do just find it really fun to channel my inner makeup artist and play around with these sorts of shades. I like that if I feel like part of my face is not looking quite right, I can just reach for some additional colors and then kind of fix it as we go along. That's in contrast to if I just put a foundation all over my face and the shade is a little bit off, there's kind of not that much I can do with it. But for this, I can really tailor it to how my complexion is looking that day and transition it with the seasons. And overall, I just really like this formulation. Like I said, that's kind of what initially drew me to this palette. It was sort of love at first swatch. And so I do recommend, if you are on the fence on this palette, to swatch it in store and see if this kind of formula would work for you. For me, what's so great about it is it's just a really nice everyday makeup product in terms of looking very natural on the skin, but can also be very much built up for a more full glam look. So it sort of covers the gamut. And if I'm really wanting something that just looks like skin and doesn't look like makeup, I think this does an excellent job. Now, in terms of negatives about this palette, I really wish they gave you more versatility to DIY this. Like, it would be really fun if you could just pop these out and interchange them with any other shades, and if they sold them individually. For me, for example, I would love to exchange some of these highlighters for blushes, since I pretty much never use all four of these, and even in today's look, I didn't really feel like they looked different enough on my skin tone to really warrant having all four. In addition, even though I think these shades work pretty well on my skin tone and I have a variety of different options for an all-over complexion product that doesn't require any additional mixing or blending, I think if you're someone who has a much lighter or much deeper skin tone, you are going to have to mix and match to get something that would approximate your skin tone. And I don't know that for me, this palette would be worth it if I had to do that. It is $80, which is quite pricey, and even though mixing the shades is quite easy, I think if you had to do it all over your face, it would just be a lot more work than it's worth. So those are my overall thoughts about this palette. I would love to hear in the comments what you guys think about this product. If you've tried it, how did it work for you? Please let us know your skin tone as well, because I do think this is, not the most versatile in terms of a wide variety of skin tones. The brand does say that if you have a deeper skin tone, you could use these more over the face and then these as highlighting shades. But honestly, I feel like these might be too cool toned for most people's complexion, and having this many light highlighting shades might be a bit overkill for most folks. So that's it for today's video. If you guys like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you all so much for joining me today, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!